Perfect. Well, I think it's time for us to begin, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this event on Black lives in the Soviet Union and today's Russia. My name is Marlene Laruelle. I'm the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University, and it's my pleasure to have you online with us today. As an institute based in Washington, D.C. and working on Russia and Eurasia, we could not wanted to react to the current revival of race tension and race politics in the US and put that in parallel with our knowledge of the Soviet Union and today's Russia, and have the two experiences kind of dialoguing with each other. And we thought it would be really meaningful to go back to the experience of Afro-Americans and African communities in the Soviet Union as a way to kind of indirectly highlight how the Soviet regime and today's Russia have been managing the question of race, and indirectly looking at from another angle to the American experience. And to discuss this topic, we wanted to have both a kind of direct voice of a lived experience of being Black in the Soviet Union and Russia, and an academic discussion on the question of race. And so that's why we decided to organize the 3-hour event divided into two parts. The first part, until 10:30, we will be receiving our guest of honor, Yelena Khanga, the most famous representative of Afro-Russian community and a TV anchor. And with her, we discuss Professor Peter Rollberg, Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research Initiative, and a Professor of Slavic Languages, Film Studies and International Affairs at GW. In the second part of the event, from 10:30 to 12 p.m., we will host an academic roundtable with 5 wonderful speakers and scholars. I will be presenting them more in details. Later, John Carew from Louisville University, Minkal Makalani from the University of Texas, Meredith Roman from SUNY Brockport, Eric McDuffie from the University of Illinois, and Sean Geary from Pittsburgh University. And I invite our audience to question during the whole event in the chat box that you have on the right on your screen, as well as on Facebook, because we are live streaming as well. And so Professor Rollberg will moderate the first part of the event. I will moderate the second one. So once again, welcome for really a wonderful event. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Peter Rollberg.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to moderate this event and to interview Yelena Khanga. Yelena Khanga was a known name to me in the 1980s when I was still living in East Germany and in the Soviet Union, and when I read her articles in Moscow News. And of course, she has undergone an incredible development coming to the United States, then acting as a media personality, a very famous media personality on Russian TV with a number of very fascinating topics, and we can touch upon this a little later. But a particular reason, and that's what Marlene already was actually alluding to, why this is, I think, particularly fascinating, is that recent events in the United States have really made many people think about alternatives of upbringing, of education, to confront what is called systemic racism. And I've seen now in the Slavic field, in those works that deal with the Soviet Union, with the Soviet experience, some beginning discourses on whether a socialist environment can actually be more conducive to racial equality, to racial justice, than a market society. And let me be very clear here. Having grown up in East Germany and in part in the Soviet Union, I have had always very strong anti-communist convictions. So for me to make this move toward reconsidering socialist alternatives is not an easy move, but I still have to say that everything needs to be on the table, and we need to think about such alternatives and aspects of education, aspects of socialist economic justice, and so on, at least to consider this. And I think the discourses will develop in this direction anyway, whether we as scholars want it or not. And so, to me, one of the most interesting ways to approach this are authentic individual experiences, such as the experience of Yelena Khanga. Yelena Khanga was born in 1962 in Moscow, And her father was actually the Prime Minister of Zanzibar. He was executed there in 1967. So he was an active politician. She became a journalist, and as I mentioned before, she came into her own as a journalist in the 1980s. For the first time, she visited the United States in 1988, and she published her autobiography, Soul to Soul, in 1992. It was later published as a paperback, and we can talk a little more about this as well. Yelena, welcome. And I wanted to ask you first if in recent years your attitude toward the American experience, your life in the United States after you first visited and then came here regularly and have a home in New York and so on, has changed in light of the political developments here in regards to racial aspects and so on.
Oh my God. First of all, hi, how do you do? I'm very happy to be with you today. But you know, you start with a very complicated question. If we could divide it into several smaller ones, it would be much easier for me to answer.
So let me ask you, because I think in many ways, I was born in 1959. So in many ways, I think our experiences are comparable.
Right.
And I know that in the 1980s, there was really the United States as a dreamland. It was a country of great promise, of freedom,
Correct.
of prosperity, free creativity, and so on.
Correct.
When you came to the United States first in 1988, was this what you expected, and was this what you found here?
Yes, it was a fascinating trip. I was the first Russian Soviet journalist that was offered to come to a newspaper as a journalist. I was a fellow at the Christian Science Monitor in Boston, one of the best American newspapers. And I saw America through the eyes of the editor-in-chief, Kay Fanning, a female editor-in-chief, which was a shock for me, because in the Soviet Union, you would never, ever at this time meet a female editor-in-chief unless that was a home and kitchen magazine, something like that. So the first thing that was really shocked me, I don't want to call it feminism, but the fact that females were respected in America, professionally respected, and you could be not only a good mother and good wife, but also a very respected editor-in-chief. That's professionally, that was very interesting for me. In terms of race, I guess that's what you were referring to. Yes, this is basically what I heard about America. But you know what really surprised me? I was also a fellow at Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government, Institute of Politics. So I saw lots of African Americans at Harvard University. And then I asked them, what about racism? We read so much that in America, Black people can't do that, can't go to school, can't go to decent that and that. And they would say that at this point, and we're talking about the 80s, it's not whether you're Black or white, it's about whether you're green. In other words, people with money, people that can afford the education, those people have much more in common than African American that has a very good education and makes lots of money as a male, and a female that works at, I don't know, at a store, somewhere at a store. So that's what really surprised me.
So in a way, you could say it was more class than race that counted in the eyes of these people whom you asked, right? So,
Yes, in the eyes of those people that I asked. And again, it all depends upon where are you asking. Since I was at Harvard University, these were the answers that I got. Probably if I was asking the same question in the streets of Harlem, I would get totally different answers. And now if I was asking these questions among jazz lovers And I love jazz. And I was in Chicago on several concerts. I was in Los Angeles, and I was asking the same questions. And they would say, racism, come on, look who is on the stage. Look, everybody's drinking together, having fun together. There are so many mixed marriages, mixed. So from what I understood, America is such a huge and different country that it's very inaccurate to come to a conclusion by asking only in one group, in one club. I mean, there is Condoleezza Rice, okay, African-American. I met her in Russia, right? And probably she has her own mind, and she would give you one answer, and then they would go and ask people that do rap, and they will give you a totally different answer. But okay, go ahead.
No, but this is interesting. So, but then going back to what happened then in these 3 decades since you first visited the United States, have there been moments of disillusionment? Have there been moments of disenchantment, of sudden shocking events or something like that? Did this modify your view of justice, of racial justice, of racial aspects in the United States in a certain way?
You know, there's one more thing that really shocked me. I was in Boston when there were riots in Los Angeles for the same reason. There was African-American guy murdered in the streets of Los Angeles. I don't remember his name, but it was a very, very big riot, and the fires were in the streets and people were breaking glass in the stores. So I went to church in Boston. It was Christian Scientist Church, I believe. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I went to African-American church in Boston. Okay, African-American church in Boston. And the minister looked and he said, "What are you doing here? Why are you still in Boston? You have to be there in Los Angeles, protecting our people because we've been killed, we'll be humiliated." And me coming from Russia with Russian Orthodox Church, where you don't understand what they're saying because they never touch upon the real life. They always talk about, you know, in their own very, you know, complicated language. And here, I thought that if the minister speaks to people and offers them to go there to protect their rights, civil rights, it was like in the years of my grandparents in the 20s when my grandfather had to immigrate to Russia to avoid racism. And I had a feeling that, hey, nothing changed. So I had very mixed feelings. Now, getting back to today, I'm very proud of what I see on television. Unfortunately, in Russia, most of the time, they don't show what's happening in the daytime when millions of people, black and white and yellow and anybody, are marching together in peaceful marches. They don't show that. But what they show is what happens at night. You know, there is such a game in Russia called Mafia, where there are dark and I don't know how to, черные силы, белые силы, how to say it.
The forces of darkness and the forces of light.
Yeah, so they show the forces of darkness and they present everything that is happening through the eyes of those people that are breaking stores and burning cars and all that, which I think is ugly and not fair. Because real America is, and that is the progress, where I believe majority of people that are marching are white. So they understand what Black people go through up till now. And I guess that was a shock to me, because in Russia they say, oh, this is the Black thing. These are Black, they even say these are Negroes that are doing that. And you see it on internet, on Telegram canals, they say, oh, that's what Negroes want to do. And I keep on Russian television, I keep on explaining to them, no, you look at what's happening in the daytime where people are united. And aftermath, those stores will receive their insurance and things will work out. But we saw the attitude of people. Some laws will be changed and the police violence will be restricted. And that's why I believe that is such a wonderful thing that's happening now in America. Yes,
so you
some
see it as a
people want to take
development.
advantage of it.
Yeah.
I accept that the fact that there are some forces that want to take advantage of it, anarchists or just people that want to steal a bag or a computer. Yeah, I don't deny that. But in the long term, I believe that this is a very positive thing that joined not only Americans, but you could see the same thing happening in Germany, in France, in Japan, in Canada. And it is quite a shock for Russians to see that among the demonstrators, there are mayors, there are some police people, there are governors that accept what's happening. In Russia, we don't understand how can policemen get on one knee in front of the, as they call them, riots, from the word rights, rioters?
Yeah, rioters, yeah.
Yeah, they don't understand that because it's not in our Russian culture to get on the knee, for policemen to get on the knee in front of anybody or to hug anybody, as we see on television sometime. So what's happening, I guess it totally switches the mind of majority of Russian people, but it gives me pride. And I believe that my grandparents that had to immigrate from the United States, they would go right back if they knew that, and they passed away, as I said, many years ago, but they are smiling right now from the skies, thinking that we knew that that would happen one day.
Can you express these views? Because I agree with you that the reporting about the events in America is rather one-sided and sometimes a little bit malicious. So, for example, I've heard this term Floydabestie, right? So like Floyd craziness and things like that in order to denounce the events and denounce this human rights movement. Are you able, because you are a well-known journalist and a well-known media personality, to say, look, there is one side that is, destruction and so on, it's regrettable, but the more important side is constructive human rights and so on?
Absolutely. That's what I do. I received lots of phone calls when this whole thing happened. I went also with some interviews on my Instagram. I participated in several conferences. I even spoke about that on Russia Today. As you know, this is a Kremlin channel. Yes, that's my duty. That's what I'm supposed to do, and that's what I will be doing. But it's very difficult to change the mind of Russian people, especially if they don't see the real story. See, the thing is that we never had slavery. We had крепостное право. How do you call it in English? Крепостное право.
Serfdom.
Okay, it is like slavery, but it was not based on the color of the skin. So this problem will never, we've read about it. Every Russian read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Every Russian saw all those movies like Gone with the Wind and all that, and the last movies that got Oscars. But this is not painful for Russians because we have our own problems. We have our own pain. For example, anti-Semitism was the real problem for Soviet Union. So lots of people understand when you're talking about anti-Semitism, there are lots of books about it, there are lots of movies about it, there are lots of documents about it. But racism was never part of Russian history. Now, if we talk later whether there is racism or not, this is another issue, and we talk about that later. But there was no institutionalized racism, and that's very important. In America, it was institutionalized, and as a result, up till now, we see the results of it. In Russia, we never had institutionalized racism. We had, how do you call it, бытовой.
Everyday life racism, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it was never a system. That's why it's hard for Russians to comprehend, to accept, and to understand it. And as white people, okay, they say, how come we have to excuse ourselves for something that we were not part of? You know, we were never slave owners, so we don't understand, why do we have to feel guilty?
Right.
And I keep on telling them, okay, this is not your story, this is their story. So try not to impose your mind on their problems.
But I mean, what you said about serfdom and slavery, this parallel was already perceived in the 19th century. And when Turgenev wrote his Sketches from a Hunter's album, and they were published with great difficulty, he basically, what he was doing was showing that serfs are human beings. They have a soul, they have dignity, they have creativity, and so on. And Alexander II, the Tsar, is supposedly he said that you are doing with your book what Harriet Beecher Stowe has done in America with her book, right? So, so the parallel between serfdom and slavery was perceived very keenly in Russia as well. Mm-hmm.
But the only trick is that in America, up till now, you can say whose great grandfather was a slave. In Russia, you cannot say whose great grandfather was the slave owner, okay, servant owner. You can't even say, let's take 1937, when the country was divided in Gulag, where half of the people were sitting in jail, half of them, hello? Am I with you?
Yes.
Okay, that
yes.
was a phone call. So half of them were controlling them, right, in jail. But in the second generation, you can't even, unless you know your family story, you can't say that. That's why there is no such a class hate, or those people that were, let's say, sitting in jail for political reasons, their children and grandchildren can go to good school, they can receive good salary, not like in America. That's the main difference.
Yeah. But I mean, just going back to the 19th century, because this is also the culture that you were raised in, right? The culture of literature, of the great writers that you actually, as you wrote in your book, you know, felt very much and feel very much at home with. I just watched this movie, Maximka, after a story by Stanyakovich, the 19th century story in which a Russian ship, sailors in the 1860s they actually save a Russian black boy, Negro boy, as they called it at this time. And it's a beautiful story. It's very popular. It's still very popular, but it also shows a certain feeling of superiority, in the sense that, look, we are above that. We don't do that. We do not distinguish people by their race, and therefore Russian society is in this regard
better,
more humane, right? So
yeah.
I think that's the
absolutely
spirit
right.
that you have. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. Those movies were done in the 60s, right? In the 50s. In those years, our country was talking about international equality. And also that was that this way we were saying that America is inhumane and
That's
we
correct.
are humane. We were using it as a politics, as a weapon, political weapon.
That's right.
To show that. And again, I want to repeat that in the Soviet Union, it was very unpolite to be a racist. If somebody called me a Negro in the street, most of the time the kids would call. Their parents would slap them. They would say, never, never say such a thing. It was unacceptable to pronounce that. And you would never, ever, ever hear anything racist on television or read it in the newspapers. That was, we can argue how sincere they are, but the fact is that children were told, adults were told that it's very unpolite and unacceptable. And if somebody discriminated you on the office, you could go to the Communist Party leader of your school or wherever you were, of your institute, and complain. And most likely the person that insulted you, he would be blamed for that, and probably he could even lose their
Reprimanded.
job.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is really probably what your grandparents, what your ancestors came to the Soviet Union for, in that, the Soviet Constitution, defined that everybody was equal, men, women, all ethnicities, and so on. I'm not even sure, the term race was rasa, rasovый, was actually a term that was not often used, if at all, because it was seen as the wrong approach to people. People should not be approached by that, right? So I have to say, when I came to the United States, the fact that people asked me about my race, I thought, what does that mean? And even the word Caucasian, I said, what do you mean Caucasian? I'm not from the Caucasus, right? So what is Caucasian? So this different kind of criteria that are applied here in the United States in regards to racial questions, it takes some getting used to that, where one has to learn that, okay, so this is the way relations between groups of people and strata of people are viewed. In the Soviet Union, I do not remember it that way.
That's correct, but let's not forget that in America, there is like 5 or 10% African Americans, right? In Russia, there's 0.000%, and probably when I was a kid, we knew each other, all of us, every Black Russian knew each other. So there couldn't be a system like in America. As I said, there was not institutionalized racism. But even though there were so many people of color in Russia, do you know how I met my husband? That's a very interesting story. It was in the middle of the 80s when the Moscow newspaper where I used to work, which was the flagman of perestroika, that was the most popular newspaper, actually in English. It was published in 5 languages and in English also. The editor-in-chief decided to do an article if there was racism in the Soviet Union. He invited a group of sociologists that had to do focus groups in different parts of the community. And then he also invited me to write the article based on this focus group. So the head of this sociologist group was Igor, who later became my husband. But the way he was doing that questionnaire, he wouldn't ask a person, are you a racist? Because he would say, of course not. But he would say, okay, you're not a racist. Do you mind working with people of color? And he would say, nah, no, I don't. And then he would say, well, do you mind if a person of color lives as a neighbor near you? So some people would say, well, yeah, because we're different cultures. It's not because of race, it's just different culture. Okay. Next question, will you mind if your son marries a person of color? And this way, he had hundreds of questions. And based on that, we came to the conclusion that Russians were racist, which is a very interesting issue, because how could they become racist if there were no people of color? Now, it was in the 80s and 90s. Now there are lots of people of color, and situation changed dramatically. But now it's also not just black and white, not just yes and no. Now, on one side, the world is open. There are lots of Russians that travel to America. There is internet. We can watch television. We all love Eddie Murphy. We all love jazz and Ella Fitzgerald. We all love Serena Williams, and I can go on and on. We have basketball players in Russian teams on one side. On the other side, you hear ugly comments of, let's say, Soviet officials. Like, for example, in Congress, in Russian Duma, it's called Congress, we have a female. She is responsible for the issues of motherhood and women, something like that. So during the championship, or during the football championship, she came out with a speech the idea was, Russian girls, please don't sleep with people of color, because then you will have colored children, and we don't know what to do with them. Nobody wants them. Now, I received hundreds of phone calls from press for comment. And my position was, if somebody is stupid and says something stupid and ugly, that's their problem. Well, whatever she said, that's her point. But there was not a single official that would come out and say, stop. That is her own position. We do not support her. And by the way, madam, please keep your ideas, racist ideas, to yourself, or you can talk about it in the kitchen at home, but don't go publicly, because you're humiliating the whole country in front of the world. So if you ask me whether there is racism or not, I would say, and yes and no. On one side, we all respect African-American culture, very much so. And we know a lot about it now. We love rap. Russian rap, we believe it's better than American, okay? But on the other side, you could see African basketball players playing for the Soviet army team, playing very well, and then somebody throws banana on the court, which is very racist.
As a provocation, yeah.
As a provocation. So it's very complicated, and you cannot say whether it's there or not.
Mm-hmm. But to put it in another context, I mean, if we think about Russia, the Russian Federation, but also the Soviet Union, only about half of the population is ethnically Russian. The other half consists of a variety of ethnicities, I think about 130 or so.
Correct.
Many of them are, for example, Central Asian, and people from the Caucasus and so on. And what you did find, and I was surprised by the aggressiveness of what I saw, is bias against those people, and there is this kind of arrogance. So I'm not even sure if that is race. I don't even know if
no,
how
it's
this
not
is defined.
race. It's not the issue of race. You know, there are some class and economical reasons for that. I will explain to you. If we're talking about today, people from the former Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, these are former Soviet republics, from Central Asia, economically, they're much, much lower than Russians. And they come here as guest gastarbeiters.
Guest workers, guest workers.
Okay, they come to Russia as guest workers, and they accept any job for nothing. They can live in a hole in the wall, 15 people, okay? And economically, for Russian business, it's much cheaper to hire them, because he would pay a group of people the same amount of money than he would pay a Russian person. Not to mention that Russian person, if he's not getting paid, he can go to police, he can go to court, you have to cover his insurance, and, you know, a headache. If you hire those people from those republics, nobody would say a word. You can avoid paying them and throw them out by just reporting them to the police, and they would be kicked out. So lots of Russians are very upset, because they say, because of those people, we cannot get jobs, and we economically are losing because of them. That's where sometimes those I don't want to say the word racist, but
maybe xenophobic, right? So it's more xenophobic.
Xenophobic.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Not to mention that Russians are xenophobic. Yeah.
I mean, I remember, for example, in a very strange manner. I mean, there is anti-Americanism. There are anti-American biases in Russia. I remember as a young man, somebody confided in me and said, you know, I don't have any bias against anybody. The only people I really hate are Poles. I said, Poles? Why Poles? What has Poland to do? And then this big tirade. But I also have to say, in this regard, is it not really human nature?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's human nature, because, for example, you could read in the newspapers when they report, you can rent, you know, those newspapers that you could write, I want to rent my apartment.
The ad. Yes, the ad.
Yeah, you could, and they would say, we rent this apartment, please, but only to Slavics, only to Slavics. And this is the most, how do you call it, the most popular comment to Slavics, not against blacks, not against Jews, not against Uzbeks, only to Slavics, period. And when you start speaking to those people and you say, well, why, what's wrong? And they would say, oh, you know, those Georgians, all those Armenians, they're called blacks, by the way. All those Uzbeks, they are not cultural, they don't pay on time, and all that. So again, this is not institutionalized racism. It is more cultural ignorance, I would say, cultural ignorance.
I sometimes think, and that goes back to what you said, why there is such a one-sided reporting about events here in the United States, where only the violence is shown, but not the human rights movement that's much more powerful and much more significant. That there is a little bit like a revenge. It's like wishful thinking. Oh, look, you have criticized us all these years. Now we criticize you, right?
Oh,
and of course, Russians, I have to say, they encounter bias in other countries a lot. They encounter bias in the Baltic states, again, for historical reasons, but still it's against individuals that probably are not to blame, right?
So absolutely. For example, we have some issues in Russia. I don't want to go into details, where people go out and they demonstrate, they march, and they get arrested. But it's nothing in comparison with what's going on in America. So officials say, oh, you're complaining about our police, but look what's going on in America. American policeman, if you touch him only by his finger, you can be murdered and nobody would say a word. You're not allowed even to look in his eyes, to get out of the car. You're not allowed. I mean, the American policeman is demonized, and they say, you want it like in America? You want to be such an easy target like in America? So we're angels in comparison with America. This is propaganda, and it's obvious, and I don't think that anybody buys it.
Yeah, I think it's a blend of human nature and propaganda, and sometimes it results in very ugly biases and very, very ugly behavior. But I mean, going back to what you said, that when somebody in the Soviet times called you a name, or so, maybe another kid or so, parents would say, don't say it, don't you ever say that, and so on, so on.
Correct.
And this is really a very important aspect to me, that education has this normative power, in that while we all may be subject to instincts and to sudden kind of aggressions and so on, but education gives us a framework when we always know, oh, what I'm doing here is wrong, and when we're reminded that it's wrong, and if it's really bad, then the law steps in, and so on. And it seems to me that Soviet education in this regard was very benevolent. Again, I'm not a proponent of communism and so on. I have to be, I have to ask forgiveness. I'm biased against communism, but in regards to educational principles, this was noble and this was good and right, and I think it had a very strong effect on people and how people viewed each other and viewed the world. And so, the fact that such racial bias or ethnic bias or other kinds of biases was not tolerated, but was actually very strictly fought, both in school, but also by the law, I think really contributed to this expectation of your ancestors that in the Soviet Union we will not be discriminated against, right? Would you say from what you learned from them when you talk to your mom and other family members, that they found what they were looking for when they came to Russia?
It's a very difficult question, because there is no one answer. On one side, yes, they were never discriminated. My grandfather was a very respected expert. He was paid very well. Nobody ever mentioned the color of his skin. On the other side, they saw antisemitism, and some of their friends end up in jail only because they were Jews. Some of their friends end up in jail for other reasons. Don't forget, these were the 30s, early 30s. I think that they were disappointed. On one side, yes, they came to the country where mixed marriage was accepted and welcomed, and nobody ever looked at the color of the skin. Yes, that's true. On the other side, for my mother, it was very difficult, and for me as well, to get a job, not because I was Black, but because my ancestors came from America. If we were white, probably in the second or third generation, nobody would remember that we were foreigners, so-called foreigners, even though we were born in Russia and had Russian citizenship. My grandmother, by the way, never was allowed to enter the Russian Communist Party, even though she, you know, came with a group of communists. So it is very, very, you know, it's not
complex.
that, yeah, very complex.
Yeah.
Now, also don't forget, there is one thing when you officially say something and you teach something, and that is wonderful, that in Russian school we were taught to respect other nationalities.
Yeah.
But again, it's important to see a reaction on something that happens, something bad that happens. And if there is no reactions, people see that there is a double moral, things that you say and things that really happens.
Hypocrisy.
As a former Soviet, hypocrisy, as a former Soviet person, you know very, very well that the things that you said at home, you were not allowed to say at school. Is that right?
I mean, I was not a Soviet person. I was an East German
Okay.
person who lived in the Soviet Union, but still, it's true. We all learned that, of course, yes. And I hated it.
Okay. Yes. So the same thing here applies to that. Officially, we say that racism is very bad. Do you agree? Of course, we agree. But when you come home, you might think different things, and you know, vice versa. You know what? I have a question to you, to a person that lives in America for a long time. When I first came to US, I met lots of former Russians in Brighton Beach. Brighton Beach. Mostly Jews that immigrated from the Soviet Union in the 80s, in the 70s, in the 60s. You know what? Even Americans wouldn't allow themselves saying the things that they do. They are more racist than Americans, because when America says something racist, they know that that's wrong. And sometimes they wouldn't say that openly because they understand that's wrong. When a former Soviet says that, he wouldn't even think twice. Now, the second generation, they say, Mommy, don't do that. That's wrong. But the Soviet people that come to America, they say, why do we have to feed those Blacks? Why don't we close the border and stop this stupid immigration? And I mean, you're listening to them and you're thinking, but you came here thanks to those laws. You were on the lowest level of the scale. And now you're looking down on Black people. That is, something was wrong in the Soviet Union if they have that state of mind. Do you agree with me?
Well, I also think that this is a misunderstanding of freedom of speech. So suddenly they can see that there is no punishment, there is no retribution for saying ugly things and just letting your bias out. One of my friends who also belongs to minority put it this way: he said, to each his bias. So each person can have their bias, and that's fine. And so they feel free to say things that normally in a cultured civil society you would find shameful, you know.
On one side, you're right, but on the other side, I believe that's economic reason for that, because most of those people in Russia, they were, let's say, middle class people. They had education, good education.
Yeah.
When they come to America, it's this downshifting for them, socially speaking, because if you were a lawyer, if you were a doctor, you have to prove your diploma, подтвердить.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to do. So
recertify, like recertification.
Yeah, recertify. And when you immigrate at the age of 40, 50, most likely you won't be able to do that. The language barrier, financial problem. So what happens if you were a doctor, you become a nurse. If you were a nurse, you become somebody that just cleans the floor or something. but they still have a mentality that they had in the Soviet Union. And they are insulted and they are upset. So what do you do when you're in such a position? You start looking for somebody who is even lower than you. And all of a sudden you see, oh, all white Americans think that black Americans are on a lower scale. And we're black, we're white, so we are higher, we're better than them.
Yeah.
And that's when they feel, and also sometimes they feel that they have to unite with the strongest, and in their mind the strongest are those, you know, I don't want to be politically incorrect and say what I want to say, but that's one of the reasons why former Soviet people become racist. I want to say some of them, because I don't want to call the names all of people that immigrated, but very often they were reporting what was happening a month ago because they speak Russian, and they sent all that with their own comments to Russia. And my friends show it to me and they say, look, that's what Americans showing us. These are Russian, Soviet Russians that live in America, and they're so afraid. Look at this couple that is standing with their gun, protecting their Russian matryoshka store on Brighton Beach, as if anybody would go to rob the, you know, bread and butter, whatever they're selling there, pilmeni, varenье. But they would do those pictures, they would do those videos, how they're protecting the house, and send it to Russia, and Russian people say, oh my God, they were going to rob our people. It's ugly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, but it's also interesting that you are able to talk about these things with such candor. I mean, when I look at Russian media today, I'm always amazed about how candid they are, especially online media. Of course, they're incredibly candid, and they let out the ugly, but they also let out the taboo violations, right? So in a way, we have to say we're in a situation where people now can say whatever they feel, they let out their emotions and so on and so on. But in regards to the immigrant community, I agree with you. That is sometimes quite disturbing. And I'm wondering if it has to do with the fact, first of all, as you said, that they are bitter about a certain class lowering, right? So lowering of their class status, and they're kind of trying to reassure themselves that no, I'm still, you know, superior to others, and so which again is I think a sociological phenomenon that can be found in many societies in times of kind of rearrangements of class and so on. But then there's also, I think, now the lacking of this cultural framework, which I think in the Soviet Union was very strict, that you should be ashamed to say certain things. You should be ashamed to even feel certain things, such as racial bias. It's just that a decent person doesn't do that. If you would express such views, you would become an outsider. You would become kind of an outcast. And that's a huge punishment, actually. So even if we have destructive feelings or biased feelings, it's something that we are trying not to show, because the punishment is a social punishment, right? It's a huge punishment.
You mentioned the movie Maximka, but there is another most popular movie called Circus.
Yeah. Yes.
That tells the story of a white American female that ran to Russia and she had a black baby. An American, who was he? I'm sure you've seen this movie. Her
Lyubov Orlova was Lyubov Orlova played the Marion Dixon was her name in the film, an American circus artist.
Circus.
She flees, and of course in the Soviet Union she finds a home. And she finds love, and she finds a community.
And the last words were, "Oh, she has a black baby. This is wonderful. Please have babies of all the colors, black, white, yellow, whatever, because you're a baby and the color doesn't." And the whole country was crying, and they've been crying 50 years ago. And if you watch this movie, you will be crying again. Well, that was the education
Yes.
and people were educated by those examples. And now we don't have movies like that.
But it's curious that you are actually citing this movie. It came out in 1936, and it was a huge success, and it was a norm setter, right? It was not just popular, but it was also setting the norm that that's how we Soviet people deal with otherness. That so for us there is no otherness. Remember, this artist Marion Dixon, she came to the Soviet Union with her impresario, a German, von Kneischt's, and this von Kneischt, he says to the audience in the circus when he shows this black baby, this woman has a black baby, look, this is a race crime, right? Это расовое преступление, he says, right? And people say, so what? So for them, they don't even understand what he means, right? So if we may, Yelena, we did not arrange this, actually. Let me say this. This came very spontaneously that you mentioned that film. I'd like to show our viewers, our attendees here, 2 minutes from that film, and then we can go back to it. Because, of course, the little boy who played the American toddler.
Do you know that he lives today in Washington?
Yes, and he was actually in my classes. I invited him to my classes. My students were just going crazy because they could. He looks like he looked then, so he was very recognizable, and it was a wonderful thing to have him. It was in the 90s. He's now a very frail
old person, yeah.
old man. He's in his late 80s, but then he was James Patterson. Yeah, James Patterson, James Lloydovich Patterson is the name. So if we could show this this little clip that I prepared, if that's possible.
Sorry, just a moment. I'm gonna get it.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, you know, I mean, this is a fantastic propaganda film. Fantastic propaganda film.
But wouldn't you say that the
Stalin,
emotions that are expressed there are authentic emotions? That these are genuine emotions? I have to say that this, the fact that this community embraces people who think that they don't belong and who need a home and so on, that this is genuine. I mean, it's not, to me, it's not just sentimental. I don't feel it's a lie. That there is a complexity there, but there's not a lie there, in my view, at least.
On one side, I agree with you, and this is a very well done film with the best actress. Lyubov Orlova was the top. I don't even know in America whom can we compare with Lyubov Orlova in those years. She was the top actress, and of course, for her to play the role, such a role that says that racism is bad, this is a very powerful message. But we all know the double moral, and we all know what happened with some of the actors that were there. Like Mikholsky was in this movie singing the lullaby, famous lullaby. He was killed after the movie.
The scene was cut out for a while, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So there is always a double moral. On one side, yes, this is wonderful that we had films like that, and I miss films like that today. But on the other side, there was always the second level, as we say, second floor, which was not such a beautiful thing. And
well, you can see the portrait of Stalin that they are carrying, right? I mean, you can see that. That of course shows you the whole paradox of this situation. On the one hand, no racial bias, refusing any sort of bias against any minority and so on, ethnic minority, racial minority. At the same time, whoever disagrees with us, or whoever is suspected of disagreeing with us, will go to a concentration camp, right? So, and
also we know how many ethnicity people went to concentration camps. We know that Estonians were sent out of Estonia to Siberia. We know that Germans were sent out to Kazakhstan. We know lots of different ethnicities that were punished for being at the same time that we were doing those wonderful movies. So this is why it's so complicated.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, I just want to mention this James Patterson, the little boy who then became a Russian poet and published several books of Russian poetry. He then came with his mom here in 1991 to the United States, and actually started writing poetry in English. He recited some to my students. So my students asked him, they said, how much bias was there against a black person in the Soviet Union? And he said, I honestly never encountered bias. He said, the only group where I saw bias was against Jews. So the only, and that's interesting that he said that, because he was a very naive, I think he is a naive person, a very kind person and so on. But he said this, and he gave an example, and I thought, this is interesting. So no bias against anybody except against Jews. And so this kind of anti-Semitic underbelly, since you have a partial Jewish heritage as well, and you explore it in your book, can you say a little bit about that? I mean, this is I think also a very unique kind of experience, to have that heritage in Soviet and later in Russian society.
Well, I guess to talk about anti-Semitism, it's better to talk to somebody else who went through that. I was never perceived as a Jew. I'm mostly perceived as a Black Russian. But yes, the truth is that lots of Jews, if we're talking about institutionalized race, anti-Semitism, lots of Jews in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were not allowed even to study in certain universities, mostly technical universities, the best ones. But it has its own anti-Semitism in Russia started not today. It was from the Tsar years. So it is inhaled in the system. So it's another issue.
maybe maybe I should reduce the question a little bit rather than just general anti-Semitism. More, what role did this part of your heritage play in your own identity formation? Did you, when you heard anti-Semitic slurs or bias, so did you say, "Oh, this is against me as well," or because
you know,
you were
there is a joke when African student rides a bus and reads a newspaper, Jewish newspaper. Oh, hold on, and somebody approached him and said, "Isn't that enough that you're black, that you also read a Jewish newspaper?" So it's like
it's a cynical joke in a way, right?
It's a very cynical joke.
Yeah.
Well, again, most of the people never thought that I was Jewish, and they allowed themselves some anti-Jewish comments, which is acceptable. Yeah. Nobody will throw you out of the company if you say something. Well, it depends upon the company, but anti-Semitic comments, anti-Semitic jokes, it's not something that will surprise you. My grandmother tells me when she went to work to an institute, and HR expert was signing her papers and said, "And by the way, can I ask you not to tell anti-Jewish jokes or make comments, because we have some Jews working here." And she was like, "But why would I even consider saying like that?" Number one, she'd never seen a Jew, but if somebody, HR expert, tells her, "Please don't do that," that means they think that that's normal for a normal person to do that, and they warn you. So unfortunately, anti-Semitism was a very well known, and not it was not, even up till now, some politicians make ugly anti-Semitic comments, even up till now.
And get away with it, and it's accepted.
Yeah. Yes.
Going back to your experience as a black woman, you said in your book, "In Russian culture, I never felt like a stranger in my black skin." In Russian culture, I never felt like a stranger in my black skin. What is it about Russian culture that has this welcoming and inclusive quality? Because I share the sentiment, many people share the sentiment. It's one that makes Russian culture very attractive. Is it Pushkin himself as the founder, the foundational character? What is it about it?
Well, number one, Pushkin is our everything. And everybody knows that he was his great-grandfather was from Abyssinia. So he had some African roots. Right. Everybody knows that. But again, it doesn't, that's so funny. The most Russian nationalists, they adore Pushkin. But the fact that he had black roots, it doesn't, It
doesn't bother them. It doesn't bother them, or they don't see the paradox here, or?
I'm sorry, something is with my earrings. It's my problem. I will just take them off, and then I will hear you. Just a second. Okay.
I said it doesn't bother. They don't realize how strange that is. That on the one hand they're nationalists, and on the other hand,
I have a problem. I don't hear you.
Hello?
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Oh,
no,
okay,
I can
now
hear
I hear you.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Pushkin is an interesting case. If I may, just 1 second, if I may interrupt you. We have in our university, George Washington University, we have the only full-size monument to Pushkin in the United States. It was dedicated in 2000, and we have prepared a picture. Maybe we can show that picture, if that's okay. Yes, it's our campus. And during the demonstration, yes, it was a huge ceremony. I had the honor of translating a verse of Pushkin for the plinth. As you can see that there, from Pamятnik. And actually during the demonstrations, there were people who actually laid flower there. You know, Washington, D.C., which has a huge African-American community, is very conscious of this. So, you know, cab drivers know Pushkin and so on. They can tell you they're proud of Pushkin. It's really interesting. So the fact that we have this monument in D.C. is quite amazing. But I do remember that when we discussed the text for the plinth, and so one of the sentences was that he was proud of his African heritage. Some official, I won't name whom, an official came to us, this was way back in 2000, and said, why do we have to mention this? You have like, you know, 5 sentences, and why does this have to be one of the sentences? And I answered because, you know, for Pushkin, this was really a central part of his identity. And you talk about this, you know, Moja Rodoslovnia, and so he was proud of it. When some people mocked him, he proudly defended his great-grandfather, Abraham Gannibal, Ibrahim Hannibal, and so on. So, you know, yes, nationalists, they like to be quiet about that. This is as if it was something, you know, the fact that he has an African great-grandfather, something that they don't like to talk about. But you said in your book, everybody in your class when you were in school knew that Pushkin had, you know, a black ancestors.
Well, everybody knew that because our teachers told us. This is not a secret.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not something that, oh, I know, and guess what, I will tell you. No, every year, thousands and millions of kids go to school on the 1st of September, and if they read any poems, that would be the poem of Alexander Pushkin. And everybody has to learn his biography, and everybody knows that his great-grandfather came from Abyssinia or Ethiopia. And it's such a known fact that there's nothing to discuss.
I'm looking here at some comments. So some people are asking questions in the chat box, and I have a problem seeing this in full. I'm sorry, this is kind of a technical problem. Okay, well, let's move into a completely different territory here from Russian literature and from Pushkin. Somebody asks that you became particularly famous with your TV show years ago.
Correct.
About sexual things,
correct,
right? So Proeta about that,
correct,
right? So it already signals that this is kind of a taboo subject. Can you say a little bit about, you know, how you were selected for that role, how you felt yourself, what role you should play? Did a show like yours, you said at some point in your book it exploded like a bomb. Did this change something in Russian perceptions, in Russian views of sexuality?
I think so, because we were the first to talk about sex on television openly.
Oh, we can't hear you, Yelena, right now. I'm not sure.
Something is wrong.
Now you're back.
Is there a way for me? I will try to, hold on a second. I will keep on talking, it's just I don't hear you, but I will be talking, hoping that probably. My show started in '96. And we were talking about sex issues. It was not what you think, it was very kosher. And we would take different issues like sex and in the office, how do you call it? Sexual harassment in the office. We were the first to talk about AIDS. We were the first to talk about education at school, sex and education. We were the first to talk about minorities and the discrimination of minorities. We were the first to talk about domestic violence. So we were talking about issues that everybody pretended that they didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And we had real people on the show, not actors like Jerry Springer used to have, but real people that came and shared their pain. And we had a show about sex and invalids, people that were, you know what invalids is, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it was such a shock for everybody, because we found out that you could talk about love not only by the words of Alexander Pushkin, poetry, and not just using dirty words of the street. You could talk about that as a mother talks to a daughter, as a friend talks to a friend. On my show, we have a psychotherapist, sex expert. We had lawyers, we had teachers. So that was a normal conversation. I don't think that you have such a show in America, nothing like that. It looks like you, either it's an X-rated shows that nobody has to see, but we were very different.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that there has been a long-term effect, like a measurable effect on Russian society of a show like yours?
Say it again.
Would you say that there was a noticeable effect of your show and of the discussions around it in Russian society? Have there been developments that are toward a more liberal, toward a more respectful attitude? Yeah.
Correct. Definitely. And even up till now, the show was in '96. Up till now, I'm approached by people that say thank you for the show, because before they said we lived in our small city, God knows where, we didn't know our rights. We didn't know that we could go to police to protect ourselves. We didn't know that we could speak out and find out that domestic violence is not only when he beated you to blood, but also when he insults you and shouts at you. Lots of gay people approached me saying thank you. In fact, even prostitutes loved our show because we were talking about the fact, well, you know, the health issues and AIDS. We were the first to say that they were AIDS in Russia, because in the 90s, in the 80s, we were lying, saying that this is American problem. Only Americans have this disease. But when we showed those people on our show, when those guys came and talked about their experience, it really shocked the world, because even up till now, we think this is a small, dirty thing that we don't want to hear about that. Let's not talk about that. Let's not collect money for that. That's, you know, only prostitutes and gays have that. And I did a show about housewives that have that problem because their husbands are not protecting themselves when they fool around, and they bring this disease home and they have unprotected sex. So this was a very big breakthrough in Russian morale on Russian television.
Did you have negative reactions as well?
Oh, absolutely. We had lots of negative. Even Congress was discussing whether they should close this show or not. But we have so much support among some very powerful politicians that protected us. And they were, you know, spying and telling us, you know, in Congress, these people want to do that people want, but don't worry, we will protect you. And so many letters, we had hate letters that sound like that. Please close this show because we hate the show number 32, the show number 25. They knew all the numbers of the shows. They were watching them all. And the show was around 1 o'clock in the morning. So we wouldn't be, how to call it? So it could be, the children won't be around.
Right.
But they would keep on writing those letters demanding to close it. And they know those shows by heart. So why were they watching them?
If you could choose a topic for a show for Russia today, where you think this is a show that I could do and that Russia now really needs, what would be about?
Oh, God. You know, nobody watches television now on Russian television. Everybody's in internet. Even Russian television is going into internet. And it is much more, it's more, you know, somebody loves politics, somebody loves, you know, culture, somebody loves that. If I was doing a show, I think the issue of nationalities, including races, are very important. I don't think I would do a show about racism because race is a very small part of all the nation. We have much more problem. When I talk about racism and I say, look, how many blacks were murdered in the last, let's say, 10 years. And there is this statistics. And they would say, okay, but look how many Georgians were murdered, look how many Jews were murdered, and blacks in comparison with all those numbers is small. Now, let's not forget that the numbers are very small of those African students that were studying here, but still it's hard to have a point when we have such a huge difference in numbers. So I would do show that would deal with tolerance, and tolerance towards people, different race, different color, different nationality, different ethnicity, people that are different sexual orientation, people that are invalids, I don't know
disabled,
how to say it
disabled
in English.
people.
Yeah, disabled, exactly. Yeah, disabled people. There are so many parts of societies that are discriminated. So I would do such a show instead of doing just
I hope you will get a
race.
chance to do that. I want to ask you a question that comes from the chat box here, and there were several actually that have to do with the term, and I have to say it here because historically it was used in the United States too. We still have it, a Negro, and then of course there's the N-word, which is a swear word and which is culturally taboo. But in Russian, "негр" is still, I think, an acceptable word. What is your view there? Because the translation "черный," black, is not a good "черный" is not a good word, right? So
well, I will tell you what. Because we have such a problem, I brought a new term. It's called Black Russian, Afro-Russian, Afro-Россиянка, Afro-Russian.
Has this been accepted? Have people used it?
Okay. Well, polite people and newspapers, they accepted this, and I'm very proud of that. But the thing is, I had this conversation with a very interesting friend of mine. He's a top journalist he works on Russia Today. And he's not a racist, but he says, Yelena, why do you say that Negro is a bad word? And I start telling him, you know better than me, the history of the United States, the early 60s, the fight for the civil rights movement and blah, blah, blah. And he says, yes, that was in the United States. We never had this problem with the fight for civil rights, freedom and all that. So it never officially changed in Russia. There was no reason for officially changing that. And Russian people have no idea what was going on in America. They probably heard about Martin Luther King, and probably the most educated heard his speech, I Have a Dream, but most likely they didn't. So for them, there is no such a difference between Negro and African American. They just don't understand why this word is considered to be insulted when in all our literature, if you take literature, even in the Pushkin, probably some books, you heard, now he wrote it 200 years ago, but in Russian mentality, nothing changed since we never had this revolution. That's why here, some people know that this is a bad word because we were told by, official people that that's wrong, but it was never, installed in our soul. Yeah. Like, let's say the word Žid in Jewish, it's technically hundreds years ago, that was the word how Jewish people were called. You could read Russian literature, that's how they're called. Now, in the 80s, this became an insulting word. And since it was in Russia, it became insulting. We all know that now it's wrong to call a Jewish person with such a word. But the N-word was never officially, never went through that switch from good word to bad word.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say black, by the way, in America, when you say black, you mean people with African American roots. In Russia, by the word black, we call not only people with African roots, but people from Caucasus, people from Central Asia, everybody that is not Slavic and not from Baltic republics might be called blacks.
Right.
And one of the reasons why my grandfather wanted to go to Uzbekistan when he immigrated here, because he felt a kinship with people that had dark skin. In Uzbekistan, people are a little bit dark skinned, like Pakistan, like Indian people. So he felt that there won't be any discrimination among them.
And did this expectation come true? I mean, was there really a better way of finding togetherness with the Uzbeks than with other people?
Oh no, there were no problems neither with Uzbeks nor with Russians. My grandfather never went through racism. And in these terms, he felt that that was heaven for his family. If in fact, in the 40s, Stalin, that was getting more and more xenophobic, he demanded that all the foreigners, if they wanted to stay in Russia, they had to change their citizenship. If they didn't, if they refused, they had to return back to their countries. So half of the group that my grandfather brought to Russia, African-American group, they returned back to America. My grandparents decided to stay in Russia because my mother was born and she was Black by American standards. Yeah, she was a mixed kid. And my grandparents thought that in Russia, she would get much better education than in the United States in these years. We're talking about 40s and 50s. And they were right, because my mother, she had a nanny. She graduated from musical school. She was playing tennis. She was champion of Uzbekistan. And we're talking about the 50s, okay? Later on, she went to the Moscow State University, which is considered to be the Harvard of the Soviet Union. She wrote her PhD. Now, obviously, she couldn't afford, my grandparents couldn't afford that for their child. So in these terms, they were absolutely right to stay here for my mother to get this wonderful education. Now, America changed dramatically, and we even had African-American president. And you go to Harvard and Yale and Georgetown University, and you see lots of African-Americans, but this is now. And my grandparents lived in the 30s and in the 40s. Yeah. So yes, they went through, they never experienced racism, but still they felt disappointed. And my mother always said that my grandfather passed away because he just was too disappointed to see the reality, to see how many people lost their lives for wrong reasons in jail.
Yeah. I want to conclude with a question that has to do with, again, this comparison between Soviet, Russian, and American culture, because, you know, cultural aspects are so fundamental in a way, right? Political aspects, you know, they come and go, they are much more temporary, but cultural aspects have a much longer lifespan. One of the ways to keep things calm in the United States, in my view, has been that many groups were able to develop their own culture. In a way, it's a separate culture, and so you have an African-American culture, and of course people can participate in them. You have a Latino culture, and so on. And on the one hand, it is beautiful that people can do that, right? So you have sexual minorities that have a culture and so on. And this is part of the American promise, which I always will defend, and I always will, speak in favor of. But at the same time, the Soviet dream, the original dream, this one that we saw on the Red Square in the film, was that all people, regardless of what their specifics are, regardless of the specifics, they are able to share one culture, and it's a culture of respect, of humanism, and so on. And that's why your ancestors came to the Soviet Union. Would you still embrace that utopia as a desirable goal for the future?
Absolutely. I embrace the dream of my grandparents. They were not communists, they were utopists. Unfortunately, the heaven that
we can't hear you. I just 1 second. I need to. This is a very important moment. Can you just repeat what you said?
I'm sorry, my earrings died again. So I just want to say that even regardless of what's happening now, I still believe that this utopia can come true. I still believe in that. And the fact what's going on in the United States now, when I see millions of people marching, and by not only people, but the police and some mayors and some governors, they embrace this idea of equality for everybody. It leaves me with the hope that we're on the right way.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Yelena. Thank you very much. All the best to you.
Thank you so much, and
Thank
good
you.
luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Same to you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter and Yelena, for this great conversation. That was really a wonderful discussion. We really enjoyed it very much, and a specific thanks to Yelena for being so open and candid about her own experience in the Soviet Union and in today's Russia. We will be now moving to the second part of our event, an academic roundtable discussing African Americans in the Soviet Union and the legacy of these Africans in Russian today. And we have 5 great panelists whom I would like to present very briefly before giving them the floor. We will have with us Joy Carew, who is the professor of Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville and a former associate director of the International Center. She is the author of Black, Reds, and Russians, Sojourner in Search of the Soviet Promise. We also have with us Minka Makalani, who is associate professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas in Austin, and is the author of The Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London. We have with us Meredith Roman, Associate Professor of History at SUNY Brockport, and she is the author of Opposing Jim Crow, African American and the Soviet Indictment in US Racism. We have also with us Eric McDuffie, Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, who is the author of Sojourning for Freedom, Black Women, American Communism, and the Making of Black Left Feminism. And we have our 5th speaker, Sean Geary, the Digital Scholarship Curator and host of the SRB podcast, a weekly podcast on Eurasian politics, history, and culture at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. I will moderate the discussion, and in fact I would like to ask you several questions and give you the floor so we can create a discussion between you, and also we'll take, of course, questions from the audience. And so many of you, in fact, have been working on the 20s and 30s and on these African-American encounters with the Soviet Union, with communism, with Comintern, with internationalism, with anti-racism, with different aspects of this really important interwar period. And I would be interested to begin the discussion to have each of you telling us about how do you see this interaction or circular influence between the politics of race in the US and in the Soviet Union, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, internationalism, and the kind of the contact with other colonial people and activists, because many of you have worked on these aspects. So I would like to begin our discussion with that kind of broad interaction question. Joy, would you like to begin?
Yes, I would be delighted. Thank you for letting me.
We can't hear you anymore, Joy.
Can't hear me?
Yes, now it's back.
Oh, good. Okay. But I was saying I'm glad to be here with the group and to hear Yelena talking about her experiences. But before we get into that, could I just piggyback from one thing that she said that I think is particularly striking when we're talking about the difference of the experiences of those who went to the USSR in the 20s and 30s that I write about in my book and many others have written about, and the contemporary experience. Looking at Yelena, who first went in the not first, but in the 80s when she went, and she's talking about the experience of being there, being a Black person born in Russia, etc., with those traditions, and saying at one point that she never felt uncomfortable in her Black skin in Russia. But she's talking about it in relation to being in the US at that time and being confronted not necessarily herself personally with racism, but seeing the effects of racism against other people who look like her. So I thought that was a very striking comparison to having grown up in this, well, for her, in a privileged tradition of those who have been the early pioneers who contributed so much that history carried on into her life. And then now having the privilege of coming to the US and experiencing something of the US that she'd only heard about before that. So I think that she really brought some interesting personal anecdotes into this that are useful, because when we're talking about why do we even discuss this today, is that much of what we know about is only headlines, often glaring, horrible headlines about difference. And she bridges so much of that.
Great, yeah, thank you. Would you like also to comment on this kind of African-American encounters with the different aspects of the Soviet Union and the Soviet ideology, especially of internationalism?
Me still? You? Okay.
If you want, I can. I'm happy.
This is internationalism at its best. I mean, if we look at those early pioneers who went, they set a kind of model for later generations who would subsequently go. So we look at the 50s and 60s where that film is being made about, you know, the great sense of community and the socialist experiment. People who are going later are going because of the earlier models that were set. And that is what we call internationalism. It is the experience of moving out of the local into a much more global context in which we can then develop as better societies. Sorry, I'm a little hoarse, but I think you heard me all right.
Very well. Minka, would you like to continue on that?
I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is where my work in the first book focus, is that what Blackness means in Russia and how an internationalism plays out when Black folks are going. What's interesting is that some of those first Black communists, the United States, as also in France, and somewhat less so in the UK, they are actually Caribbean. So they're coming from one imperial racial context to the US, making sense of their world and their position in an American racial context. And then they go to Russia. And so the first are Claude McKay and Otto Hieswald. McKay's Jamaican, Hieswald is from what is now Suriname. And what's interesting about that, and you can see McKay talking about this, and you also see it in the resources, is that on the one hand, so they're coming, and those first Black people going to the Soviet Union are coming in the wake of a range of Asian radicals who really pushed the Soviet Union and the Communist International around what is the national question, how does race fit into this, and where does Asia and Africa fit into that dynamic. But then they go and see how their different racial makeup plays out in terms of the racial imagination that people have in the Soviet Union. And so McKay is not an official member of the American Communist delegation, but because of how he looks and the imagination of what a Black person is, he's celebrated. He talks about his picture being plastered everywhere. And Otto Hieswald having a bit more of a difficult time because he isn't seen as what they think a Black person should be. So that's like one of these ways that the race plays out in the Soviet context for those who come to it in ways that both mirrored kind of racial dynamics. So McKay actually did feel a certain hesitancy about light-skinned Blacks based on how race and color plays out in the Jamaican context. But then if you follow that trajectory over the 1920s and into the 1930s and the different contexts that people are coming, you see where the Soviet Union allows for a form of internationalism that isn't just rhetorical, nor is it simply confined to what is occurring in the United States. So it's through the Soviet Union, through the Communist International, that people from the US are able to make actual linkages to people from France, people from the UK, African maritime workers in Germany, and then real sustained linkages to people on the African continent, especially West Africa and the Caribbean. And so you get this interesting way that the Soviet Union and the infrastructure of the Communist International allows for a level of internationalism that is sustained organizationally rather than simply episodic in terms of when you can have international meetings. But it also turns on these conflicting racial imaginaries, these sometimes at odds, these notions of what is a Negro, what is, and how a light-skinned Black person, say like Heath Wild or Cyril Briggs, or the people who continue to come into the Soviet Union later, how they're seen in Russia. And so it's a really interesting story. And I think it really does, this is one of the areas where you see a kind of internationalism that takes off in the 1950s and 1960s, really taking root and flourishing.
That's great. Meredith?
Yeah, I think, you know, to Minka's point, the Communist International, while it was a problematic institution, the sort of proclamation in today's language that Black Lives Matter creates these really radical spaces for people to congregate from around the world to try and make Black Lives Matter, right? So they come, it doesn't lead immediately to a racially egalitarian society, but you have African Americans coming and trying to work with Comintern leaders or Soviet leaders and basically saying, you know, Blackness comes in many shades, that you know, dark skin does not make you more of a Black person than a light skinned African American, right? There's also, I think, so much we don't know about, especially the interactions, the conversations, the ideas that were exchanged, not just in the formal speeches of the World Congresses, you know, of the Comintern, but also through the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, through the International London School, which again, all the time, African students and African Americans are always challenging. They're not sort of rolling over and saying, this is a racial paradise, this is fantastic. Right? The only reason why a large number of African American students are admitted eventually to the International London School, which was seen as more prestigious, was because they basically called out Comintern leaders and saying, hey, you're operating an all-white, more prestigious institution and putting all the persons of color in this sort of less prestigious institution. So I think it's one of the reasons why I was excited and drawn to the 20s and 30s, because there is this period of hope, and there is this anti-racist, anti-colonial community that even if you did not go with that agenda, you were drawn into it, right? So even someone like Robert Robinson, who goes to find work and employment, he's not necessarily a committed communist, but he's drawn into it because of the value or the sort of declaration of Soviet anti-racism. He's drawn into it in ways that he's often uncomfortable with, but he also sees that it does have some kind of tangible value in his life, which then he can't completely just discount Soviet anti-racism as completely propagandistic. And of course, you know, and I'll end with this, the white Americans who saw this world where Black Lives Matter were very outraged by it. They saw it, even if it was for propagandistic purposes and it wasn't done for genuinely anti-racist reasons, they saw it as very dangerous and something that needed to be ended because they didn't feel comfortable living in a society where Black lives were supposed to matter.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Eric?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Again, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this symposium. Some great scholars, fantastic conversation. And I'd like to commend your institute. I think what it's doing is you're extending the study of the African diaspora by centering Russia and the Soviet Union. At the same time, you're extending Slavic studies by centering African descended people. So there are multiple conversations at work. You know, I guess I'll just chime in or echo what many of my colleagues have said. Well, actually, first, I'll start with this. Something that very much intrigued me about the first conversation, which I thought was quite interesting. Peter's question at the start, when he posed, is a socialist society more conducive to creating an anti-racist, economically just society than a capitalist society? And it seems to me that's one of the underlying questions of this panel, especially, and again, in light of Black Lives Matter, in light of the resurgence of white supremacy, not only in the US, but across the world, growing economic inequalities, and the very real possibility of President Trump being reelected. I think looking at the experiences, encounters of African descended people in the Soviet Union, in Russia, provides real insight to trying to create the possibilities of forging a new world. So that said, I'll just say a few words about my first book that looked at Black women, US Black women, and their encounters, their involvement in the US Communist Party. And what I argued was that these women forged a dynamic community and a path-breaking radical Black feminist politics that I called Black left feminism. Actually, I should note that the literary scholar Mary Helen Washington coined the term, but I extended it to look at Black women and their engagement with the Communist Party, the International Communist Movement from the 20s through the 50s. And again, how they forged a trailblazing Black feminist politics that was, of course, intersectional, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and of course, anti-sexist. So that said, several of my subjects, or in particular, Louise Thompson Patterson visited the Soviet Union in 1932. She spent several months there. She was part of a group of African-American travelers that included Langston Hughes, and they attempted to make a film called Black and White, basically a Soviet propaganda film on race in the Soviet Union and beyond. The long and short, my subjects, they were intrigued by what they saw, and especially Louise Thompson, what she thought she saw, or how she read the Soviet Union as not so much a paradise per se, but a place where she could be fully human. She was intrigued with Soviet women's enhanced rights, with abortion rights, the respect that they were given. And certainly, on one level, they misread the complexities of race, class, gender, sexualities in the Soviet Union, in ways in which it seemed that Ms. Khanga, she seemed to acknowledge that when she came to the U.S. For the first time, she almost saw it not quite as a paradise, but as a place that was more progressive than what she saw back home. And the ways in which a person's Blackness, the ways in which their social location, their privilege, how it shapes how they see the world. So that said, I think I'll stop for now. But again, the key though is how my subjects, how they imagined the Soviet Union, or the possibilities for creating another world, a world without racism, a world without sexism, a world without imperialism, international solidarity. Certainly we can call out the contradictions and paradoxes, shortcomings of the Soviet Union, but still the promise of these of the Soviet Union, indeed, I think is quite intriguing.
Thank you so much, Eric. Sean?
Oh boy, where to start? A few things. First, I think I'll comment on the promise. I think we have to consider that and remember that the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the revolutionary fervor of that period in the early 1920s comes at a time of a really dark place in American racial politics, right? You have you have basically white pogroms against African Americans in the summer of 1919. And when you look at the rhetoric coming out of the Soviet Union and out of the first, congresses of the Communist Internationale, which is, speaking forcefully against colonialism, against racism, this really does, and this goes to Eric's point about the Soviet Union as an imaginary, it really captures the imagination of Black radicals of all across the political spectrum to a large extent. I mean, I recall, for example, Cyril Briggs, who's in The Crusader, saying, if they're going to call us Bolsheviks, then we're Bolsheviks. And here, I think here we see the first beginnings in the American context of anti-communism being very, very connected to anti-Blackness, right? Throughout the 1920s, if you look at surveillance reports of African-American radicals and nationalists, you see FBI reports that really try to find a Bolshevik hand. I think it was in Theodore Kornweibel's book, Seeing Red, he says that the security services in America behind every radical Black politics was a Bolshevik hand, Bolshevik money, and Bolshevik influence. So I think that in a way, African Americans who were more on the left were drawn to the Soviet Union as much as they were pushed to it as well, because of the tie between anti-communism and anti-Blackness. And frankly, we still see that today. We see that in the political rhetoric today. And I honestly don't think we can separate white supremacy in the United States from anti-communism. They're fundamentally connected. Second, and this goes to all of the people here on this panel who do all this work that has greatly influenced in some of the projects I'm working on, is that I think what's really important is to see how African Americans, but also the Black diaspora in general, use the Communist Internationale and were agents in it. It's really interesting that, and some of the things I've been looking at, how African American communists like Harry Haywood, for example, used the Communist Internationale as a way to bash the white leadership of the American Communist Party, to force them to take race seriously, to force them to put resources in Black politics and anti-racist work. This is a really, and how a lot of Black communists were really fundamental to shaping the policies of the Communist Internationale in terms of course, the race issues in the United States, but also anti-colonialism in general. And, another thing too, and this goes to Minka's work, is that the experience of not just being in a separate context in the Soviet Union and how that affects one's identity as an African American and one's sense of Blackness, but seeing and connecting with other anti-colonial activists and putting the struggle for anti-racism and racial equality in the United States into a global context, making connections between the anti-colonial struggle in Asia, the anti-colonial struggle in South Africa, in Latin America. I think what the Communist Internationale and the Soviet Union provided is a way to expand the political imagination. And when we look at the political struggles today, I think in the United States around racial equality, I think one of the things that is sorely missing is that international context, that international, ability to broaden the imagination. And this is something that I think is fundamentally important for this history and understanding it.
Thank you so much, Sean. You brought a lot of different aspects about what history matters today also, and what it's important for us to have a discussion. I'm of course welcoming our other speakers to kind of interact and comments on each other. So if you would like, before I move to another question, if you would like some discussion, you are very much welcome to answer to each other.
Yeah, I'll offer a quick comment. I think that when we look at the 1920s, the attraction there and those in that early period is clearly political. These are people who are going to learn techniques that they can bring back to their home locales. By the 30s, this is a different group that's going. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't people who are communists, but there's the economic imperative. We have the Great Depression. There's also the human spirit imperative. You know, Langston Hughes says it's an arc to me to be able to go and work on this film project, because in the States, as a Black man, no one would take his work seriously. Or for the agricultural specialists who are going in the 30s, and that's Yelena Khanga's grandfather and grandmother. They are people who are highly skilled. You know, they've learned these skills, particularly in cotton and other agricultural skills in the States. But then when they graduate the universities with this technique, they can only work in, you know, service jobs elsewhere. So to be able to go to this place that is promising an opportunity for all of goodwill to come and work along with building the society is very attractive to people who are, as Sean was saying, you know, we've got Jim Crow, we've got other forms of domestic terrorism going on. You know, it didn't matter if you lived in the North, you had relatives in the South who were suffering. So as a Black person, you're constantly reminded of your lack of humanity, lack of ability. So for those who are going, this is setting an enormous precedent, not only for them and their adventures, but also for those who remain at home, who are taking example from them. So, you know, in a sense, the internationalism is that ability to go out and take advantage of something, but then to serve as a role model to people back home and in other countries that are going to learn about this. So when I was talking earlier about later generations, many of those students who are going to go after the Congresses of the 50s and early 60s are going because some uncle or somebody they heard about went in the 20s and 30s and was received with respect and able to contribute to building this new society. So I think that it's an interesting, complex story that we're obviously just touching on now. I hope people will do more reading on this after our Zoom event ends, but it's an opportunity with the activism that has risen now after George Floyd's death, which is not the only, but after a series that happened before and then a series after, we have in many disciplines now started to realize that we have an incredible wealth of information that we could be sharing in terms of this human potential to work together. And in this particular case, that bridge between the US and USSR and African American and other Black people being that conduit of the dialogue.
Yeah.
And I would add just a little bit. Sorry.
No, fine.
Add just a little bit to kind of extend a point that Sean got at, and I think Eric got at as well. And I think, you know, this is to think about the 20s as you have Black people going to the Soviet Union and very active in these different institutions, the Comintern, different parties, different subsidiary formations. One of the things that, you know, when Sean was talking about the idea that people were always looking for the hand of the Bolsheviks, you know, the Moscow gold, that kind of thing. And what it often tends to obscure is that these weren't people who were going as blank slates to then be radicalized and then be given all their ideas. Now, they definitely were, in many instances, going for educational purposes or going to get particular kind of training that would allow them to do different kinds of things. But what often is overlooked in this period is that Black people are actually, along with Asian radicals and those in the Middle East, they're actually informing and shaping Comintern policy and Soviet policy in an international context. And so they aren't just going and receiving a politics, but they're actually going and shaping that politics. And so when we think about kind of the range of Black political imagination, as Eric was talking about, and kind of, you know, jumping ahead a little bit to thinking about why this matters today, is that people were going already with the sense that there needed to be something beyond what we were dealing with in, say, the US or in the Caribbean or in British or French Imperial Africa. And that ability to try and think beyond and imagine something beyond what they actually existed in. The Soviet Union became a context. And it's so, as Cedric Robinson might say, you know, we shouldn't see it as the source of that politics, but one of the tributaries to this larger politics. And so unraveling that history becomes really important, because you can then pull apart the different ways that it was generative, also the different ways that it was problematic and limiting. And I think this is also important, because you have a number of people who go and they become disaffected just as much as those who go and become energized and have a lifelong commitment. And so, you know, it's the ability, and I think this is why the work that everyone has done is really important, because you get to see not just kind of the rosy picture, but you also get to see the problems. And then when we think about what that, how we can think beyond the maybe diminished returns of focusing on only electoral politics in, say, the US today. I think this is one of those histories that becomes very vitally important to that.
Great. Eric, you wanted to
Sure.
add
Yes.
something?
Yeah. Just to echo and to add to what folks have said. Something that Sean said, I think, is about the current moment. I think is quite significant. I mean, right. We witnessed the largest protest movement in U.S. history this past summer. Right. Perhaps 18 to 25 million people took to the streets across this country, and indeed beyond, globally, in response to police killings of George Floyd and countless other Black people. And Sean, I think your point is well taken when you suggested that what might be absent in the current moment, and of course I mean, it's not completely absent, but again, a kind of internationalism. And again, we're not trying to suggest that we want to turn the clock back to the 20s or 30s or the 60s or 70s. That was its own historical moment and its own historical juncture. But I do think that you are onto something. That it seems to me that, and I don't know if it's too early to start talking about Black Lives Matter per se. But again, this kind of internationalism, and I would also say perhaps a kind of dearth, a kind of lack of conversation around trade unionism, but that's for a different time. But again, you know, as Joy pointed out in her book, right, that, you know, again, the promise of the Soviet Union, the promise of a better society. I think that is the most important intervention or legacy of Black folks going to the Soviet Union.
Meredith, would you like to add something?
I think the only thing I'd like to add is that a lot of, to Joy's point about those, and to Minka's point about people traveling to the Soviet Union already with a conviction in mind and an openness for a different form, economic system, political system, because what was not working in the United States was just so obvious to them. But we have so little knowledge about the experiences of these African-American politicals who did not write memoirs, like Harry Haywood, who did not leave archival papers. And so my only sort of encounter with them are in the, you know, sort of personal biographies that they're writing when they're entering the Communist University of the Toilers of the East or the International Lenin School. So you have names and you have some pretty scripted responses to questions. So it's also a world that's still, I wish we could access and recreate, because there are so many voices who we don't know if they left with complete disaffection. We don't know if they were true believers and just didn't want to be found, or if it was some kind of much more complicated version of how they experienced the internationalism, the anti-racism. And it's it's unfortunate, and hopefully we can somehow recreate that world and sort of access those voices. But there are so many experiences that we don't know because of the legacy of white supremacy, because of the legacy of American anti-communism, that it's unfortunate, and hopefully some scholars that come after us might be able to sort of find a way to access those voices or make those voices speak. But I think acknowledging that we only have the voices of a few politicals, if you know, to put it that way, their experiences, I think also is important to acknowledge.
Yeah, that I think is also it's a really great comment you have been doing, Meredith. Sean, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I want to speak a little bit about this problem, because Meredith is absolutely right. The problem of the archive. For the last year, I've been collecting the personnel files of African Americans that went to the Soviet Union, and it's a very difficult thing to do because a lot of them went under aliases, so you have to figure out what their real names are and find the files. But also the files themselves, as Meredith pointed to, they have a file only for particular reasons. Like, so if they go to the International Lenin School or if they go to the Toilers of the East, the file is generated. The files are very hit and miss in terms of some of their information. But at the same time, these documents give a lot of interesting things. Like, for example, sometimes they'll have an autobiography. So you can get more information. Sometimes they have letters of complaint. Sometimes, like, for example, in the person I've been focusing a lot on, Lovett Fort Whiteman, you get denunciation letters against him. And then you can track those letters against other files of people mentioned in the letters. So it does allow for a mapping, but in terms of that kind of experience that Meredith is pointing to, that is very difficult to get at. And one of the approaches and that I'm trying to do, and this is a suggestion too, is that I've been spending a lot of time on Ancestry.com, because here is try to track down, okay, are there relatives? Do they have anything? Where are these people? And that presents all sorts of other issues, because, all of us who are historians, people exist only if there's paper about them. And it's the footprint drops off for a lot of these people. And it's difficult to find, where they ended up after they came back to the Soviet Union. Unless they continue to be prominent people like, William Patterson or Harry Haywood or Claudia Jones or people like this, or they do oral histories like Maud White Cats or something like this. So yeah, the archival issue is a major problem, and we certainly should be aware of its blind spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Would some of you would like to add on something, otherwise I would like to continue and asking another question. Eric, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, it's a great point. This is fascinating, and I would take it not only in terms of we need to look or questions around the archive, but also questions around topics, especially sexuality, private lives. So, for example, I didn't know when I was conducting my research that Louise Thompson Patterson had an abortion in the Soviet Union. Keith Gilliard's new biography on Louise Thompson Patterson raises that point. And I put that out there as, the Soviet Union as a terrain, not only for Black folks to rethink race or imperialism, but also questions around gender and sexualities. Certainly there has been some work, Black queer Marxism, or Sasha on the book on Claude McKay. But I think in terms of topics, there's still so much more work that can be done in terms of, as folks have pointed out already, looking at people who did not write memoirs, who are not well known, and or again on a range of topics, and also to look at the experiences, and Mika certainly alluded to this earlier, actually discussed this earlier, to discuss non-US Black people and their encounters in the Soviet Union, more focus on them. I think it's quite needed.
Yeah, in fact, that was one of my questions, kind of following question about how the Soviet Union played a role of mediator or intermediaries between Afro-Americans and Africans. Right, because so I'm coming, as you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from France. And so for us, of course, Soviet internationalism, it's mostly the one we know is mostly toward Africa, because that was really the Soviet Union as an alternative to the French colonial power or to the British one. And so I was wondering in your research how the connection, I mean, did Soviet internationalism play a role in kind of creating a triangle where you would have kind of direct connection between Afro-Americans and Africans going through any kind of Soviet aspect or communism or internationalism aspect. So if you could develop also on that aspect, because today, if we look at the Afro-Russian community today, it's of course mostly an Afro-Russian community coming from Africa more than from the Afro-American, of course, just by number. So if we want to study the Afro-Russian community today, it's really the link with Africa that is demographically the dominant one. So if you could comment on that kind of triangle, I think that would be great also.
Yeah.
I don't know who, Joy, yeah.
Well, certainly the closeness between Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois, particularly after World War II, was a direct, proved to be a direct bridge between the Soviet and the Soviet experiment and the newly independent African nations. There's no question. I mean, Robeson's speeches, same thing for Du Bois' speeches, while in the Soviet Union were often cast on the radio to populations that would be coming on board as they gained their independence. So that's a direct bridge. If you look at the late 1950s, early 60s period, that I can think of. So people who come from that early 1920s, 1930s era who remained supportive of the Soviet experiment through all the years and all the travails that they underwent here in the United States, et cetera, who then traveling back to the Soviet Union after they got their passports returned to them, become that sort of beacon. Look to the Soviet Union, look to the Soviet experiment. So quite purposely became part of that message that Russia is now sending to these new populations with an eye to the Cold War dialogue over hearts and minds, obviously. I'll let someone else speak as well.
Yeah, I would want to get on this because I think it also gets back to this question of archives. And so on the one hand, you have how even in the U.S. this facilitates the kind of broader Communist Party infrastructure facilitates these linkages across kind of ethnic lines. So the Communist Party, particularly in New York and in other places, Chicago comes to mind, allowed for and facilitated these political solidarities between, say, African Americans and Haitians in both Harlem and Brooklyn. And then in Chicago, you have the same kind of facilitating of these connections across ethnic lines that other organizations, with the clear exception of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, didn't really foster. But then internationally, more generally, you have, so Sean mentioned Levitt for Whiteman. So he is at the Comintern's 5th Congress, I believe it's 1925, and he meets a Guadeloupean lawyer who's a member of the French Communist Party, Joseph Goton-Lyon, and then comes back to the United States, is put in charge of establishing the American Negro Labor Congress, and communicates with Goton-Lyon about coming to Chicago for its founding. And interestingly, this is, so you have also in the French context in Paris, Lamine Senghor, who's Senegalese, who had been injured in World War I, returned to Paris and was involved in the Union Intercoloniale and different political formations. He's, on the one hand, not supported in a local election by the French Communist Party, but when he proposes coming to the United States to attend the American Negro Labor Congress, he's told to work as a stowaway, or to stow away or work as a steam hand to make the trip. And so these two things are kind of the proverbial straw, and he leaves the French Communist Party. And so you have this moment that was rich in the US, but then that was missed. However, it's picked up again in the League Against Imperialism. And so this is 1927, a Congress in Brussels that was an international anti-imperialist Congress, which brought people from around the world. But you have there, and I don't have the photo pulled up, but there are these this one image of Richard B. Moore, who's from Barbados, coming out of Harlem, member of the African Brotherhood. He's there with Lamine Senghor, with Joseph from South Africa, with Max Blancourt from, I believe, Martinique, or I can't remember exactly where. So all these French Caribbean, West African, a South African, and then they develop this political document that ties the fight against white supremacy in the US to what's going on the African continent. And that document that they put out, you see this awareness of them working through this communist global organizational effort. But you also see them thinking about their political concern much broader than just what that organizational structure allows. And what's really interesting is the backstory to this is that William Pickens is also trying to get to, I believe it's either 1927 or 1929. He's trying to get, I think it's 1929. He's trying to get to a meeting, I think in Frankfurt, and he's unable to get there because of delays or whatnot. But you see in his papers where he's writing everyone in the US, the NAACP gives him funds to attend this. It's reported on by Du Bois and Crisis Magazine. So even those institutions in the US which wouldn't seem supportive, and those institutions in Paris which wouldn't seem supportive of Black communists at this point, are seeing these international conferences and these international organizing activities as vitally important to their struggle against racial oppression. And I think that becomes a real barometer of what the Soviet Union represented to a wide range of people. That often, if we look beyond the normal realm of where we can find the information, the normal archives that we go to, we get to see how much broader and richer that history is.
Great. Any other comment on that aspect?
I'll just add that there is, of course, the famous, or I guess famous among specialists, conflict or disagreement among students in the Communist University, the Toilers of the East, African students, basically complaining to Dmitry Melnitsky that this is the most racist country in the world. And you have some of the African-American communists saying, well, actually, there is no Jim Crow, so it's not as bad as you were making it out to be. And so there's a disagreement on tactics and how critical they should be of Soviet leaders and how patient maybe they should be in terms of the changes that need to be made, because the African-American communists are basically saying changes need to be made, but there's a bit more, there's a little bit more patience given the fact that they're coming from white dominated societies, and they're saying, well, yes, these white people aren't as bad as white Americans. We need to give them some time to work through these issues. Whereas most of the African students obviously are not coming from predominantly white societies. So they're like, this is not acceptable. We can't be treated like this on the streets, or being offended by racist caricatures in children's magazines, or being called monkeys on the street, that this is not okay.
Yeah, great point. If I may ask a last question. Yeah, please, of course, Shem.
Yeah, I want to speak to the Cold War period, because here you have a different phase. It's a different context, of course, but here the African, the facilitation of the communist world in general with the African diasporas is also another spot, because not only do you have students from Africa coming to the Soviet Union in the 1960s and into the 70s, you also have African students going to East Germany, Czechoslovakia. You also have the connections between Eastern European nations, in many respects with their own relationships separate from the Soviet Union with African nations. And some people are working on this now today, this relationship between Czechoslovakia and anti-colonial struggles. And this is, I think, more of a question, but I that hopefully somebody will deal more with. But what role did these spaces in, say, East Germany or Czechoslovakia or in Bulgaria or in the Soviet Union proper, whether it's in Moscow at the People's Friendship University or in Kiev or Kharkov, played in as a space of anti-colonial, sharing and development, similar to how these Comintern spaces played in the 1920s and 1930s to form a broader, anti-colonialist movement. Because, for example, at the People's Friendship University in the 1960s, they formed, official student unions, but, from some of the racist incidences that we know of, these student unions played an important role for centers of protest against racism in the Soviet Union, for example. So, just to remind that there's a lot of rich stories, I think, that need to be told in the Cold War period that hopefully, since, the archives of the secret services of, Eastern Europe are opened, and Ukraine, for example, that a lot more work can be done in these areas.
Yeah, that's really a great point. In fact, I would like to move maybe to some of the questions directly, because they are quite relevant, and to what I wanted to be the last question, which is why history matters today. But in fact, many questions are kind of asking us to make that links. And one of the first questions we have is about the fact that many communist platforms have been or were emphasizing workers' rights more than race issues. And so one of the questions is, how do you think the compatibility between these ideas can push forward an agenda which is both pro-labor and anti-race? And I think question, we have seen it here, we have a kind of reverberation of what is happening now in the US, and for example, the discussion inside the Democratic Party about, what should be more leftist, what should be more identity politics, how do we manage race and class issues, is expressing race a way of expressing a class situation. So I would like you, if you could, to articulate this kind of race/class issues, both historically and maybe with some allusions to what is happening now. Who would like to begin?
Yeah.
Yes, Joy.
Well, certainly when we look at it historically, Padmore and Haywood in particular, part of the reason why they left the Communist Party was the fact that the question of race was constantly an issue there. So while they were attracted to the Soviet part of the Soviet experiment, they are leaving the London Communist Party, or in the US, leaving the US one, because of that intractability around centering race and questions of racial bias, etc. But when we look at, just a quick question, thing about this, the university, and I'll let somebody else pick up on this, is that what's interesting, and this is something I hope our archives will tease out, a lot of those young people who went to the Soviet universities or the Eastern European universities became the leaders of the countries that they went back to. So there's no question that the contributions of this free education, which in some cases could be as much as 10 years through advanced degrees, had an impact on Africa's development, broadly speaking. And that's something that I've been trying to do, is sort of talk to, for those who will talk about it, because it's interesting, there's sort of some will discuss it, some won't. But I know that having spent that much time in the Soviet Union, getting their professional training has to have had some impact on them as persons. And then, of course, when we're talking about internationalism with their fellow students, the people that they spent so many years with, And then they're going back to their home countries where they're going to play significant roles in the development of those countries. So those who were in university in the 60s, by the 80s and 90s, they are now back in their home countries having a significant impact. And I think that would be a fascinatingly rich area to study.
Yes, great. Other comments on that pro-labor and anti-racist agenda? Yes.
Yeah, I think at least one of the things I heard Joy say is I think this was a given for a lot of the Black people who were going to the Soviet Union or who were in communist or leftist adjacent organizations. I mean, this is definitely, you know, in terms of Padmore, it's his refusal to measure his criticism of British and French imperialism for Soviet policy. And this is one of the reasons that he cites for leaving the Comintern. So there was always this attempt to see these as tied together as opposed to viewing them as two separate issues that had to be linked. Their concern was more so that these were inextricable. And I think one of the things to really get at and really grapple with people who are raising questions around class versus identity politics is that it tends to miss that all politics are based on some identity, that no politics is free of an identity claim. And so when we think about it in those terms, to talk about class is to talk about an identity politics that, because of our intellectual and theoretical frameworks, we assume is objective. And then race becomes, you know, ephemeral. It becomes something that we can declare an allegiance to, or we can disavow. And I think that what is missed in that is that these were also identity politics. And so what is important to remember with a lot of these Black radicals and Black communists is that they were also making claims about what is central to Black liberation against other segments of the Black community. So the Black elite, the Black middle class, that those became issues to struggle around and centering Black people, either peasants, workers, or colonial subjects. And I think that becomes, if we really grapple with that history, then we begin to really see how they were already articulating from the 1890s, 1880s, some of the first Black socialists were articulating a sense of class and race as inextricable, as opposed to two things that had to be joined.
Mm-hmm. Other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that, and that this is in the conversations around, and this is just because I've been reading a lot of it this week, around the adoption of the Black Belt thesis in 28, is, you know, there is an impression that I see amongst a lot of left-wing leaning people today that, you know, before the 1960s, left-wing communist movements were very class-focused, and it's only when this identity politics came in that everything kind of got ruined, right? This is a very rough picture. But if you look at the discussions in those years, in the 1920s and into the 30s, they were wrestling with a lot of the same issues that today are being wrestled with, of course, using different language, right? But they're trying to tease out this question of the role of race and what particularity does it give to Black workers, for example, or you know, rural farmers in the South and the Black Belt. How does race figure into their particular social economic, conditions? So, you know, if you look at these discussions, you see that there is no, you know, moment in which it was a class-only thing. It was always and they were trying to, it seems, wrestle with how are these more connected than how are they separate struggles. I mean, in 1928, when they adopt the Black Belt thesis at the Sixth Comintern Congress, there are explicit statements, and pushed, of course, by black communists in the U.S. party, that the struggle for black liberation is fundamental to the class struggle in general. And those who do not accept that within the American party are called racists, are called white chauvinists, and are even in some cases expelled as a result of this. So, you know, to this history of this relationship between class and race, I think that looking back at these conversations that, you know, as Minka said, start already in the 1880s and into the 1890s, that they continue throughout the century and are still with us. And perhaps this history, though we can't repeat it for many, many, many reasons, we should, you know, see and try to learn from it. And another thing too, in terms of the identity question, you know, one of the things black communists in the 20s and 30s pushed in the American Party, and using the Communist Internationale as authority, is the lack of attention the CP leadership put on racism within its own ranks. And this is what drove a lot of people to be disillusioned. But at the same time, it also, as they said in the internal documents, how are African Americans supposed to trust the Communist Party if we can't deal with racism in our own ranks? They've already heard promises and promises from left-wing organizations for decades. So, you know, in a sense that unfortunately these questions are still with us on the political left.
This is a great conversation, and if I could just jump in and echo and add to what my colleagues have said, absolutely. You know, going back, Aminka, what you said. I mean, so for you know, the very first black socialist, Peter Clark, you know, the school teacher from Cincinnati, centering race and racism to the socialist agenda. M.N. Roy taking on Lenin at those early, M.N. Roy, the Indian communist, a Marxist, you know, taking on Lenin, taking him to task and not appreciating the centrality of anti-imperialism, people of color to the world revolution. And this question about identity politics, what's so interesting is that it's the black left where so much path-breaking and fascinating theorizing on the intersections of race, class, and gender happened. So, for example, as many of you all know, the concept of triple exploitation, which is now foundational to feminist theory, to intersectionality, to Black Lives Matter, came out of the Communist Party, came out of, in fact, out of the National Negro Congress. And Louise Thompson, in a 1936 article, Toward a Brighter Dawn, actually used the term. And of course, now Claudia Jones's seminal 1949 essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, again, is in some ways still so ahead of its time in terms of not only appreciating the intersections between race, class, and gender, but and I think here's what so often falls out when we talk about intersectionality and identity politics as it was understood in the 70s, and what folks were basically saying decades ago was that they were talking about a transformational politics. So it's not just one's identity, we're seeing these politics or these various forms of oppression being linked, but again, ultimately trying to create a new world. And it was, again, the Black left that was a key site for this work, for helping to lay the foundations for the Combahee River Collective, the Third World Women's Alliance, that now has very much informed the activism and thinking that we see right now around Black Lives Matter.
Any other comments on that aspect? Okay, so we had another question that was looking more at the political side of things. So many of you mentioned how much during the 20th century in US culture, any kind of Black activism was associated with Bolshevism, communism, and even now we see Black Lives Matter very often being accused to be leftist or socialist or whatever the terminology may be. But so we have several questions asking us, and maybe that's in particular for Sean, but I welcome everybody to comment on the other side, which is that now we feel that Russia is supporting far-right party, especially sometime in the US white supremacists. So should we look also at today's Russia as defending a kind of white international or positioning itself on that line? Or how do we reconcile this kind of Soviet past of supporting Afro-Americans, Africans movement, and today's Russia being, it seems, on the other ideological side of the political spectrum? Sean, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Are Russians white? That's the first question I have. Anyways, you know, it's tragic because of the history of the 20th century in the Soviet Union, where you had, at least rhetorically, you know, putting aside the complex practices, but rhetorically support of anti-racism and anti-colonialism, that it's tragic that that history has been either in Russia has been forgotten or denied as just propaganda. And you saw the ugly side of this in the response to the protests, and Yelena was talking about this, the way the Russian state television portrays the protests here in the United States. But I think it's really important to note that it wasn't just Russian state television. I saw this across the Russian political spectrum. I saw expressions of racism amongst Russian oppositionists, the liberals. So this, I think, in terms of pinning this on the Russian state, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and outright racism within Russian society today, especially when it looks outside the world to the United States. In terms of this internet bots and trolling and things like this from the Russian government, stirring up the races, as they used to say in the 1920s. On the one hand, this is an old trope. If you look at the press reports, like, for example, when Levitt Fort Whiteman comes back to the Soviet Union in 1925, if you look at the press reports about him, it's the same type of rhetoric. The Bolsheviks are stirring up the races. The Bolsheviks are doing this. The Bolsheviks are doing that. I'm sorry. Race in America doesn't need an outsider to stir it up. It's fine with stirring it up itself, right? This in a way is that to look at Russia as some sort of instigator of racial strife in America is some sort of psychological sublimation of the actual everyday racism of this society. We don't need trolls and bots to stir up racial animosity and racial problems here in the United States. I think we've been doing, unfortunately, a good job of that ourselves. And frankly, I find the assertion quite offensive.
Thank you, Sean. Do we have any other comments on that aspect?
I'll just add to Sean's point about the racist feelings, the pervasiveness. I was drawn to African Americans in the Soviet Union because of the racism of post-Soviet society, to try and make sense of it. And I can't claim full understanding, but I'm looking for clues to see where it went wrong, right? So I think part of it is confronting the racial paternalism that often informed and drove a lot of the anti-racist rhetoric, the constant portrayals of one-dimensional portrayals of African Americans as victims in need of saving, the lack of a nuanced studying of actual white supremacy and its operation beyond sort of sensationalized images, which then made it very difficult for people to understand how you could have some affluent African Americans if they're all victims, right? And that they're all being lynched, or they're all being, sort of having dogs sicked on them at protests. So So the racial paternalism, the resentment that Soviet leaders used to make American racial violence for so long to obscure their own atrocities, I think also helps to lead this resentment, and a desire to reject Sovietness as a means of asserting a new identity. And that means rejecting any form of anti-racism, internationalism. Some could say they want to get back into Europe by doing that. I know there's been a lot of literature written about the countries of Eastern Europe and how rejecting communism means rejecting feminism, means rejecting internationalism, means rejecting anti-racism. So I think all of that helps us to try to make sense of what's going on, that very ugly reality, and how we can go from a society that was claiming it's to be anti-racist and committed to an anti-racist agenda, and the conversation that preceded ours about the teaching, the cultural framework that was, if you are in school, if you are a modern person, if you're a civilized person, you're ashamed to think anything racist or say anything racist. So how do we make sense of that? And I think racial paternalism, one-dimensionality, the use of American racial violence to claim Soviet superiority, all these factors. And then, of course, the resentment of supporting anti-colonial struggles and giving African students in the 60s and 70s stipends that far exceeded that which Soviet students received. That also did not promote feelings of internationalism, but resentment.
Can I say one more thing to this? I'm sorry if I'm. Yeah, Meredith is absolutely right. And if you look at the press, a lot of the press commentary about the Black Lives Matter protests this summer in the United States, in Russian press, and here I'm speaking of the oppositional press, there is this direct connection to Bolshevism. It hangs as a specter over this, that, well, this is just, this is what the Bolsheviks did, and there is a very strict anti-communist, anti-Soviet, reaction to what's going on here in the United States. The other thing too that I think we need to remember and bring into the conversation is that Russia is a multi-ethnic society, and the discussions of race, I think, are made even more difficult in the Russian case because of the long legacy of ethnic hatred. I mean, Yelena pointed to anti-Semitism, which of course is, one could say, the primary, if you want to look for a primary racism in Russia, it's anti-Semitism. But also, the resentment towards Uzbeks or Kazakhs or Tajiks for Soviet development in the 1960s and 70s as another form of resentment, in Russian society today. I just saw somebody point out on the chat about whiteness in Russia. I mean, this is why I asked the question, are Russians white? And if they are, what does that mean? And it's here, I'm reminded of a moment that Langston Hughes in his I Wonder As I Wander says, he has to, as he's traveling on the trains in the Soviet Union, he has to remind himself that the Russians are white because it just doesn't fit in his matrix, right? So, I mean, this is another question in terms of what does whiteness mean in that other context, and how does it relate to racism against non-whites or so-called white, non-so-called white?
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, we have in the comments someone telling us that exactly what is missing in our knowledge on Russia is an exploration of what whiteness means in Russia, and the fact that even if in the US now we are kind of attempting to challenge the notion that race is something that only non-white people have. We don't have the same studies done on the Russian side and kind of exploring what whiteness can mean in Russia. If I may continue the discussion, we have an interesting question that asks us to speak or to think not only as scholars, but as teachers. And what do we tell to our students? So globally to our students, when we want to attract them toward that aspect of the study of the Soviet Union or of the links between Afro-American history and history of the Soviet Union, and what do we say also specifically to our students of color who are interested in entering that field. And I think that's a very important point, because we had a discussion last week already at the Institute about that aspect, that it's really that the Slavic studies field is clearly a white field with very little diversity. And so the question we were discussing, how to attract students of color to Slavic studies without giving them the impression that they should access Slavic studies only through the angle of Afro-American or African connection, because everybody should be able to access Slavic studies for all aspects of the field. Of course, can be from Pushkin to Putin, right? And not specifically through a kind of a very localized angle. So if each of you could comment on how you talk to your students and how you try to attract globally and specifically a student of color, if you want to comment on that aspect. So if we could speak for a few minutes as teachers, that would also be, I think, of interest for our audience.
Well, I'll start. My students in Pan-African Studies found it absolutely amazing that Black people would have any interest in going to Russia. And part of that is the idea that anybody would leave home to go to a strange new place. And I think that's the problem of today. We have people who, as bad as things might be here, they think the rest of the world is far worse. So why would I leave here to go there? So for them, I tend to approach it from the point of agency, people taking agency and changing their lives, and tend to address it that way. Now, of course, my work is focusing on the African Americans and to some degree, people from other countries who came through the US to the Soviet Union. But I find that my students are absolutely fascinated with the idea that you could have this internationalism in the Black community, because our struggle here seems so very localized to the context of race, systemic issues here in this country. So for them, it is the idea that you are part of a group of people who can be agents of their future.
Thank you so much, Joy. Other comments on that aspect?
I
Yes.
would add to that. I think, you know, I often find that I'm talking to students who are, particularly in Texas, they haven't had much travel outside of the state of Texas. We have a large Nigerian population, so maybe Nigeria and Texas. And so it's always, it's exciting to see how they are responding to histories that they have no connection to, or totally unaware of, but they see similarities in their own experiences. And so that's one avenue that I found that is generative, but probably more suggestive in some ways are those students who have activist inclinations. And this is kind of echoing what Joy was saying, but it's getting them to think about the history of looking outside the US for not so much political validation, but to see that there were alternative possibilities and different ways of approaching the same kind of subject matter, so that we don't have to limit ourselves to what we are told are the acceptable range of political options, that we can actually be a bit more daring, and to also recognize their limitations with that. And so what we're really doing with this history is trying to learn that doesn't provide us, learn from that history, not so that we then have a blueprint for how we move forward, but we have a sensibility for the kinds of possibility that we might come up on. And so it's that daring, you know, to Joy's point, to think about someone who is a World War I veteran, who's been through a race riot and then goes to the Soviet Union, or someone who's coming from Trinidad, comes to the US, is involved, and then ends up being possibly, in George Padmore, one of the most important people in the Communist International for a time in Russia, no less. And so if they can have that kind of daring vision, then what might we be able to do, and how might we be a bit more experimental and expansive in our thinking?
Great point. Would
No.
someone else?
Eric?
Yes.
Oh, Eric.
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in. I'll pivot a bit. One of the things I try to do, certainly try to encourage my students to, where I teach the Soviet Union, but thinking, or as Minka said, right, that how we can look at the Soviet Union, and the country hasn't come up, the PRC, China, or Tanzania, or Ghana, or Cuba, as models, as alternatives to the world in which we live, and to take all the lessons, both good and bad, from those places. But something else that I try to do, and this speaks to an earlier thread in the conversation about the links between white supremacy and anti-communism. And something that I try to do is when we talk about the Soviet Union, when we talk about the Cold War, to not only talk about it in terms of the past, but to understand how, as Gerald Horne argues, the great historian Gerald Horne argues, how white supremacy and anti-communism are the two fundamental characteristics of post-World War II U.S. life. And of course, anti-communism and race, and indeed sexism, go back to the 19th century, but certainly, of course, in the importance of these two forces in the post-World War II world. And so, in short, what I've been trying to do, and we'll talk about this in class today. Why are Black folks in this country dying at such high rates from COVID? Well, it's in part because this country has no national health care system. Why? Because this country associates, national health care with socialism, and the way in which socialism is so raced and gendered and so forth and so on. So, trying to make these histories concrete and real, so that they can understand how the past applies to the present and indeed the future.
I'll jump in what to tell students, or how to attract students of color into Eurasian studies. I mean, Eurasian studies, and I say Eurasian because all of us in centers now are all claiming a Eurasian label, is ripe for that, just because it's a multi-ethnic society, right? We have to, and here's self-criticism, like after doing this research on the African-American encounters with the Soviet Union, I have to totally redesign my history of the Soviet Union course. And I have to redesign it to put multi-ethnicity and interactions with the colonial world, interactions internationally, as a center for the narrative of the Soviet experience. And this also goes for the history of Imperial Russia as well. There is a lot of wonderful, wonderful scholarship in both periods, Imperial and Soviet history now, on nationalities, Russian and Soviet nationalities, nationality policies, etc., colonialism, imperialism, that really gives us no excuse to maintain our courses as Russian only. And I think by this, not only will it make the story or narrative of teaching the history of those places, much richer and better and more correct, it will also perhaps hopefully capture the imaginations of students of color who are concerned with similar questions. How does the Russian Empire incorporate national minorities, if at all? How does it deal with nationalism? How does the Soviet Union do it? How did they try to solve this problem of multi-ethnicity to create a super Soviet identity, just like the problem of America creating a American identity? I think we could bring students of color in by example, by actually designing courses that reflect those issues.
That's a great point. Meredith, would
I'll
you
just
like to add? Yes.
Quick, I know we're running out of time. I think the history of the Soviet Union is a great place to teach, especially American students, about constructions of race. Because, as Elena Khanga mentioned in her interview, Georgians, Armenians, Chechens are seen as black, right? And treated as black or racialized as black, especially in the post-Soviet space, but we can argue there is even a Soviet precedent to that. So how they understand then that race isn't necessarily tied to skin pigmentation, but is much more complex than that. It's a descriptor of power not held rather than, you know, sort of anything that can be readily identifiable based on just skin color alone, especially when there's no indigenous African descended population, large population in the Soviet Union. I integrate Langston Hughes. We read Langston Hughes. We read portions of Yelena Khanga's memoir. I try to get them to deal with Homer Smith and his memoir as well. And I try to bring Angela Davis into the mix as well to show sort of the evolution of African-American counters too with the Soviet Union. And as much as possible, I try to get the non-Russian, the Soviet nationalities who are not of Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian descent to sort of show, because the students I have so little knowledge of Russia itself, and then of nationalities, where there's an Uzbek, there's an Uzbekistan, there's a Georgia that's not in the United States. So it's a lot to tackle, but I think if you're enthusiastic and patient, I think it can go a long way in showing just the complexity that this isn't just another European country. And we talk about the fact that in America, Russians, you know, for a long history dating from the European Enlightenment, Russia is not, they're off-white, they're not really, they occupy this liminal space. So how fascinating is that when you're talking about constructions of race, that these off-white people, these red people then with the communist system are then creating world havoc by trying to incite this race war, as, you know, anti-communists claim in the United States and throughout Western Europe. So I think that it's a great way to get students to think about their own assumptions about race and racism and the constructions of racial minorities and discrimination.
Terrific. Well, we are running out of time, but I'm very happy we kind of discussed that last aspect, because I think it's kind of also showing all the great direction of both research and teaching that we see emerging when we try to suddenly put under this kind of put into dialogue what we know of the Soviet and today's experience. And Sean was mentioning even Imperial Russia and what we know about US history and US today. So I hope we have been succeeding during that seminar to kind of trying to highlight some of this connection. I wanted to thank all of you for a really great discussion and wonderful scholarship. And everything, all the 3 hours of our seminar will be on our YouTube channel, and we were also live stream on Facebook, and Sean will be probably doing a podcast based on our joint discussion. So I hope it's just the kind of new beginning or kind of continuation of trying to put this, both the US experience and the Soviet Russian one, into dialogue. And we really need more dialogue by this time between US and Russia globally. So once again, thank you to everybody. It was really a wonderful discussion, and thank you to our audience who stayed for 3 hours just to show you how much people were interested in our discussion. So wishing everybody well and good online semester for all of us. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. It was great talking to you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Marlene, for setting this up.
Thank you all for participating.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.